Have you ever heard of a boy who was born to be a king but chose to fight for his people instead? A young man who loved boxing, not for violence, but for discipline? A prisoner who spent 27 years behind bars, only to walk out and become a president? This is the story of Nelson Mandela. Mandela was no ordinary child. He was born into a royal family. He could have lived a comfortable life as an advisor to the king, but destiny had bigger plans for him. Instead of ruling from a palace, he became a fighter for justice, standing up against the most powerful system of oppression in his country. Now, did you know Mandela was also a boxer? Not the kind who fights in the streets, but the kind who believes in strategy, patience, and strength. Boxing taught him that true power is not about how hard you can hit, but how much you can endure. And endure, he did. Imagine this. You are locked in a small prison cell for 27 years. Every morning, you wake up to hard labor. You break rocks in the hot sun, with no hope of freedom. Most people would lose hope. But Mandela? He stayed strong. He read. He learned. He waited. And then, the unthinkable happened. After nearly 3 decades, he walked free. And he didn't seek revenge. No. Instead, he forgave. And in 1994, at the age of 75, he became South Africa's first black president. The world watched in awe as the prisoner became a leader, proving that no cage, no wall, no oppression could ever break his spirit. For this, he won the Nobel Peace Prize, not for fighting with weapons, but for fighting with wisdom, not for dividing a nation, but for bringing it together. Nelson Mandela's life is proof that no matter where you come from, no matter how many obstacles stand in your way, you can change the world. So, if you want to learn more about his incredible journey, stay with me. This is not just history. It's a lesson in courage, in strength, and in never giving up. And you? Want to learn English through amazing stories? Subscribe to the channel and join our Facebook group, Learn English with Stories 365. Link in the description. Now, get comfortable, listen carefully, and let's begin the inspiring life of Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela's early life and childhood. Our story begins on July 18, 1918, in a small, quiet village in South Africa. It was a place with green fields, tall hills, and clear blue skies. There were no big buildings, no cars, and no electricity, just nature and simple village life. Nelson Mandela was born into this world with a very special name. His parents named him Relatable, which in his language, Xhosa, means pulling the branch of a tree. But some people say it also means troublemaker. Do you know someone who was a little bit of a troublemaker as a child? Maybe you were one. Well, little Relatable Mandela wasn't a troublemaker in a bad way. But one day, he would shake the world just like the wind shakes the branches of a tree. His family was not rich, but they were very respected. His father was a chief, a leader in the community. His mother was a kind and loving woman who taught him about kindness, respect, and faith. Mandela's childhood was simple but full of happiness. He lived in a round, mud hut with a thatched roof. There was no electricity, no running water, and no modern luxuries. But do you think he was unhappy? No, he was full of energy. He loved to run barefoot in the fields, herd cattle, swim in the rivers, and play games with his friends. Life was simple, but it was good. At night, the village elders would sit around the fire and tell stories. These were not just any stories. They were stories of great warriors, wise leaders, and brave heroes. Young Mandela listened carefully. He wanted to be strong like them. He wanted to do something great with his life. One day, his father told him something that he would never forget. He said, "A real leader does not take power for himself. A real leader serves his people." These words stayed in Mandela's heart. He did not know it yet, but one day he would become one of the greatest leaders in history. But childhood does not last forever. When Mandela was just 9 years old, something sad happened. His father became very sick and passed away. It was a terrible moment for the young boy. He felt lost, alone, and scared. However, this was not the end of Mandela's journey. It was just the beginning. His life was about to change in a big way. Are you ready to hear what happens next? Let's continue. Education and awakening to injustice. After his father passed away, young Nelson Mandela's life changed forever. His mother took him on a long journey to a new home. They traveled to a royal palace, where a powerful chief named Janjantaba lived. The chief was not just any man. He was a leader of Mandela's tribe, the Thembu people. Chief Janjantaba welcomed Mandela into his home as if he were his own son. Mandela now lived in a big house, very different from his small mud hut. Here, he watched leaders make decisions, learned about the history of his people, and saw how the world worked outside his small village. Now, let me ask you, do you remember your first day of school? Were you excited? Nervous? Well, young Mandela was about to start his education, and something very surprising happened on his first day. At school, his teacher gave him a new name. She said, "From today, you will be called Nelson." It was common at that time for African children to be given English names at school. Mandela didn't really understand why, but he accepted it. And so, Ralilala became Nelson. Mandela was a curious and hard-working student. He loved to read stories, learn about geography, and study history. But most of all, he loved learning about African heroes, people who fought for freedom and justice. These stories inspired him. He began to see that the world was not fair. But what does not fair mean? Let's imagine two people do the same job. One person gets a big meal at the end of the day, but the other person gets only a small piece of bread. That's not fair, right? Well, in South Africa, something much bigger was happening. The country was ruled by apartheid, a system that separated people by race. Black people and white people could not live together, go to the same schools, eat in the same restaurants, or even sit on the same benches. Black people were not allowed to vote, own land, or get good jobs. Mandela saw this everywhere. At the age of 16, Mandela went through a traditional Xhosa ceremony. In his culture, this was the moment when a boy became a man. The elders gave speeches about being strong and responsible, but they also spoke about something else, how their people were suffering under apartheid. Mandela listened carefully. He felt something deep inside him. A fire started to grow in his heart. He thought, this is not right. Something must change. But at that time, he was still young. He had more to learn, and life had many surprises waiting for him. One of those surprises was an arranged marriage. Yes, Chief John Jintaba wanted Mandela to get married. But did Mandela want to? No, he had other dreams. He wanted to learn more, see the world, and make his own choices. So, do you know what he did? He ran away. That's right. Young Mandela left home and traveled to the big city of Johannesburg. He had no money, no job, and no plan. But he had courage, and he was ready to start a new chapter in his life. Are you ready to find out what happens next? Let's continue the story. Path to activism. Have you ever moved to a new city? Everything is different. The people, the streets, the way of life. Well, when young Nelson Mandela arrived in Johannesburg, he felt excited but also scared. Johannesburg was big, loud, and full of energy, but it was also a place of deep injustice. Black people worked long hours for very little money. They lived in small, crowded houses while white people lived in beautiful neighborhoods. Black children could not go to the same schools as white children. Black workers were paid much less than white workers for the same job. Mandela saw this and thought, this is not right. But first, he had to survive. He got a job as a security guard at a gold mine, but it didn't pay well. Then, he found work as a clerk in a law firm. During the day, he worked hard. At night, he studied by candlelight, determined to finish his law degree. Have you ever tried to study when you're tired? Mandela knew the feeling, but he didn't stop. He believed that education was the key to freedom. At university, Mandela met many other young, passionate students. They all had the same dream, a South Africa where black and white people were equal. One day, Mandela heard about an organization called the African National Congress, ANC. It was a group of brave men and women fighting for equal rights. He was inspired and joined immediately. But wait, how do you fight against injustice? Do you use violence? No. At first, Mandela and his friends believed in peaceful protest. They marched in the streets, gave speeches, and refused to obey unfair laws. In 1944, Mandela and other young leaders created the ANC Youth League. They wanted to bring new energy to the movement. Mandela's powerful words and strong ideas made him a leader. People listened to him. They believed in him. Have you ever heard this famous quote? It always seems impossible until it's done. Those were Mandela's words, and he truly believed them. During this time, Mandela also found love. He met a young nurse named Evelyn Mays. She was smart, kind, and shared his dream of a better South Africa. They got married in 1944 and started a family. But Mandela's fight for justice was just beginning. Then, in 1948, something terrible happened. A new government took power, and they made apartheid even worse. New laws separated black and white people even more. Black South Africans lost more freedoms, jobs, and rights. Mandela knew he had to act. The fight was about to become even harder. Would he give up? No, never. He was just getting started. But the road ahead was full of danger. Mandela was about to risk everything. His freedom, his family, even his life, for what he believed in. Are you ready to hear what happens next? Let's continue the story. Struggles and imprisonment. Nelson Mandela had a choice. He could stay silent and accept the unfair laws of apartheid, or he could stand up and fight for justice. What do you think he did? Of course, he chose to fight. At first, Mandela and the ANC tried to protest peacefully. They marched in the streets, they refused to follow unfair laws, and they spoke to crowds about freedom. But the government did not listen. Instead, they arrested protesters, beat people, and made life even harder. Then, in 1960, something terrible happened. Thousands of black South Africans gathered in a peaceful protest in a place called Sharpeville. But the police opened fire on the crowd. 69 people were killed, and many more were injured. It was a dark day. Mandela was heartbroken. He had always believed in peaceful protest, but now he started to wonder, was peaceful protest enough? The government was not listening. It was time for a new strategy. Mandela and his friends formed a secret group called Umkhonto we Sizwe, which means Spear of the Nation. Their plan was not to hurt people, but to damage government buildings and send a message. We will not be silent. But the government saw Mandela as a dangerous man. They called him a troublemaker. They wanted to stop him, and in 1962, they finally caught him. Mandela was arrested and put on trial. The government said he was a criminal because he fought against apartheid. They wanted to give him the death sentence. But Mandela was not afraid. He stood up in court and gave a powerful speech. He said, "I have fought against white domination and I have fought against black domination. I have always believed in a free and democratic society where all people live together in harmony. It is an ideal for which I am prepared to die." The courtroom was silent. The judges listened. The world listened. Mandela was not sentenced to death, but he was sent to prison for life. He was taken to a place called Robben Island, a cold, lonely prison in the ocean. Prison life was very hard. Mandela had to do heavy labor every day. He wore thin clothes, even in the cold. He slept on the hard floor. He could only send one letter every 6 months and have one visitor every year. But did Mandela lose hope? Never. Instead of feeling sorry for himself, Mandela kept learning. He studied history, law, and politics. He taught other prisoners about leadership. He even learned the Afrikaans language, the language of the people who put him in prison. Why? Because he believed that to defeat your enemy, you must understand them. Mandela spent 27 years in prison. Can you imagine? 27 years. Some people would have given up, but not Mandela. Outside the prison walls, something was changing. People around the world started saying, "Free Nelson Mandela." Musicians wrote songs about him. Leaders from different countries demanded his release. South Africans of all races began to fight back against apartheid. The government tried to break Mandela, but they failed. Instead, Mandela became stronger. He was no longer just a man. He was a symbol of hope. Then, one day, something incredible happened. After years of protests, pressure, and change, the South African government finally had no choice. In 1990, after 27 years, Nelson Mandela walked free. Can you imagine that moment? The gates opened. Mandela, now an old man with gray hair, walked out, but he still stood tall. He smiled, and he raised his fist in the air. The world cheered. Mandela was free, but his fight was not over. Now, He had to fight for a new South Africa. Are you ready to hear what happens next? Let's continue. Release and fight for democracy. Can you imagine being locked away for 27 years? That's almost 3 decades. When Nelson Mandela walked out of prison on February 11th, 1990, the world watched. People cheered, cried, and danced in the streets. Mandela was 71 years old, but he stood tall. His hair was gray, and his face had lines of wisdom, but his spirit was stronger than ever. Thousands of people waited outside the prison, shouting his name. Mandela, Mandela. The whole world was watching. And what were his first words as a free man? Did he say, "I want revenge"? No. He said, "The time for healing has come." Wait, healing? After everything the government had done to him? After taking away his freedom for 27 years? Yes. Mandela believed that revenge only creates more pain. But forgiveness can create a better future. South Africa still had a big problem. Apartheid was not over yet. Black and white people were still divided. The government still had laws that kept black people as second-class citizens. Mandela had a huge decision to make. Some people wanted to fight with violence. They were angry. They wanted to punish the people who had supported apartheid. But Mandela said, if we fight hate with hate, we will never have peace. Instead of war, he chose peace and unity. He met with the same leaders who had once called him a criminal. He shook hands with the people who had put him in prison. Some people could not believe it. Would you be able to forgive someone who hurt you? It's not easy, is it? But Mandela knew forgiveness was the only way forward. Then, something historic happened. In 1994, South Africa held its first free election. For the first time ever, Black South Africans were allowed to vote. Millions of people stood in long, long lines just to cast their vote. Some people waited for hours in the hot sun, but they didn't care. They were voting for their future. And guess who won? Nelson Mandela, the boy from a small village, the young man who once ran barefoot in the fields, the prisoner who never lost hope, became the first black president of South Africa. On the day of his inauguration, leaders from around the world came to watch. People cried tears of joy. Mandela raised his hand and said, "Never, never, and never again shall this beautiful land experience the oppression of one by another." It was a new beginning. But was Mandela's work over? No. He had one more mission: to bring the people of South Africa together. And do you know one of the ways he did it? With sports. South Africa's rugby team, the Springboks, was mostly made up of white players. Many black South Africans hated the team because they saw it as a symbol of apartheid. But in 1995, South Africa hosted the Rugby World Cup. And guess what? Mandela wore a Springboks jersey and cheered for the team. People were shocked. But Mandela wanted to show unity. And something amazing happened. South Africa won the World Cup. It was a moment of national pride, where black and white South Africans celebrated together. Mandela had shown his country and the world that forgiveness is stronger than hate. But after one term as president, he did something unexpected. He stepped down. Many leaders want to stay in power, but Mandela knew that true leadership means knowing when to let go. So what did he do next? Did he rest? Did he go on vacation? No. Mandela spent the rest of his life fighting for peace, education, and human rights. He traveled the world, meeting young people, leaders, and even celebrities. He spoke about love, kindness, and hope. He helped in the fight against poverty and HIV/AIDS. He never stopped giving. Mandela showed us that one person can change the world, even if the journey is long and difficult. But as all great stories do, his life had to come to an end. In 2013, at the age of 95, Nelson Mandela passed away. The world mourned his loss, but they also celebrated his life. And so, the question remains, what can we learn from Nelson Mandela? How can we take his lessons and apply them to our own lives? Stay with me, because in the next part, we'll talk about his legacy and the lessons we can learn from his incredible journey. Presidency and Legacy. Nelson Mandela was no longer just a leader. He was a symbol of hope, not only for South Africa but for the whole world. As president, Mandela had one big goal: to bring people together. For many years, South Africa had been divided by race. People were angry, hurt, and afraid. Some wanted revenge, while others feared change. But Mandela refused to let the past control the future. He believed in peace, forgiveness, and unity. One of his most famous acts as president was supporting South Africa's rugby team, the Springboks. Before, rugby was seen as a white man's sport, and many black South Africans hated the team. But in 1995, South Africa was chosen to host the Rugby World Cup. Mandela saw a chance to unite the country. He wore the green and gold jersey of the Springboks and told the team, "You can bring this nation together like no one else can." And then, something incredible happened. South Africa won the Rugby World Cup. The whole country, black and white, young and old, celebrated together. For the first time, people saw that they were not enemies. They were one nation. This moment was later made into a movie called Invictus. The title comes from a poem that Mandela loved, which ends with the lines, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." Mandela knew that even after years of suffering, we still have the power to choose our future. A leader who knew when to step down. Many leaders want to stay in power forever, but not Mandela. After one term as president, he did something surprising. He stepped down. He believed that true leaders must know when to let go. After leaving office in 1999, did he relax? Sit by the beach? Take a long vacation? No. He spent the rest of his life helping people. He traveled around the world, meeting leaders, students, and young children. He spoke about education, peace, and equality. He helped in the fight against poverty and HIV/AIDS. He believed that every child deserves a chance to learn and grow. Mandela once said, "Education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world." Do you agree? Think about it. What is something new you have learned that changed your life? Maybe learning English is opening new doors for you right now. The final chapter. As the years passed, Mandela became older and weaker, but his spirit stayed strong. On December 5th, 2013, at the age of 95, Nelson Mandela passed away. The world mourned his loss, but they also celebrated his life. People from every country, from every background, came together to honor him. Leaders, celebrities, and ordinary people all said the same thing. Mandela showed us the power of forgiveness, love, and never giving up. What can we learn from Nelson Mandela? Mandela's life teaches us many things. Here are just a few. Never give up. No matter how difficult life gets, keep going. Forgive, even when it's hard. Holding on to anger only hurts you. Education is power. Keep learning. Keep growing. One person can make a difference. You don't have to be famous to change the world. And maybe the most important lesson of all, it always seems impossible until it's done. So, what about you? What is something that feels impossible right now? Maybe learning English? Maybe chasing your dreams? Remember Mandela's words. Keep going. Now, before we finish, let's review some important words and grammar from this story. Stay with me. Key vocabulary. Now, let's review some important words from Nelson Mandela's story. Learning new words will help you understand and speak English better. As I say each word, try to repeat it after me. Let's go. 1. Apartheid. Apartheid was a system in South Africa that separated black and white people. Black people could not vote, live in the same areas as white people, or have the same rights. It was a very unfair system. Example: Nelson Mandela fought to end apartheid in South Africa. 2. Freedom. Freedom means the right to live, speak, and act without fear. It is the opposite of being controlled. Example: Mandela wanted freedom for all South Africans. 3. Prison. A prison is a place where people are locked away because they broke the law. But sometimes, innocent people go to prison, like Mandela. Example: Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison. 4. Forgiveness. Forgiveness means letting go of anger when someone has hurt you. Mandela forgave the people who put him in prison. Example: forgiveness is not easy, but it brings peace. 5. Leadership. Leadership. Leadership is guiding and inspiring others. Mandela was a great leader because he helped his country without hate or revenge. Example: good leadership means helping people, not controlling them. 6. Democracy. Democracy is a system where people choose their leaders by voting. South Africa became a democracy when everyone was allowed to vote. Example: in a democracy, all people have the right to vote. 7. Hope. Hope is believing that things will get better, even in hard times. Example: Mandela never lost hope, even in prison. Quick review. Now, let's check your memory. I will say a word, and you try to say the meaning before I do. Ready? What is apartheid? What is a prison? What does forgiveness mean? What is democracy? Great job! Learning these words will help you speak English better and understand Mandela's story more deeply. Now, let's look at some important grammar from the story. Key grammar points. Now, let's look at some important grammar from Nelson Mandela's story. Understanding these grammar points will help you tell stories better in English. Are you ready? Let's go. First, we have the past simple and past continuous. We use the past simple to talk about completed actions in the past. For example, Mandela was born in 1918. This happened once, and it is finished. Now, what about the past continuous? We use it to talk about actions that were happening at a specific moment in the past. Look at this. While Mandela was studying, he realized the world was unfair. The action was studying was in progress when something else happened. Here's a fun question for you. What were you doing yesterday at this time? Think about your answer. Maybe you were watching a movie. Maybe you were studying English. Now you can use the past continuous. Next, let's talk about reported speech. Reported speech is used when we tell someone what another person said. Imagine Mandela gives a speech and says, "Education is the most powerful weapon to change the world." If you want to tell your friend later, you don't say the exact words again. You say, "Mandela said that education was the most powerful weapon to change the world." Let's try one together. Imagine your friend says, "I love learning English." How do you report it? That's right. You say, "My friend said that they love learning English." Now, let's look at passive voice. This is very useful when we want to focus on the action rather than the person doing it. In Mandela's story, we see sentences like, "Mandela was arrested." But who arrested him? The police, of course. However, we use the passive voice to focus on Mandela, not the police. If we use the active voice, we say, "The police arrested Mandela." But in history and storytelling, we often care more about what happened rather than who did it, so we use the passive voice. Here's a fun challenge. Can you change this sentence into passive voice? People all over the world celebrated Mandela's release. Think about it. The answer is, Mandela's release was celebrated all over the world. Great job! These grammar points, past simple, past continuous, reported speech, and passive voice, help us tell stories clearly and powerfully. Just like Mandela's story, your stories matter too. Keep practicing, keep learning, and keep believing in yourself. Now, tell me in the comments, what did you learn today? And don't forget to subscribe to Learn English with Stories 365, and keep learning English with us.